Hello and welcome to another episode of the F1 Hour with my friend and yours, the goatiest of all F1 goats that we've ever goated, the one that they call Mr. Peter D. Windsor. How are you doing, good sir?
I'm good, mate. Where are you? What's that bedroom going? What are you
I,
doing
I,
there?
I mean, I'm somewhere in Turkey, mate. It's
Cool.
interesting, yeah, different background, but apparently the better half demanded that I put my feet up a little bit, but yeah, the F1 news beat doesn't sleep, Peter, so I had to take a laptop and get this
Oh, good
conversation
on
in.
you. Nice little mic you got there. You going to go out to the Grand Prix track and see how many weeds are growing there?
That might be an idea. Although they might have a grant, but no, they won't. Will they? They're not
Mhm.
going to reschedule anything this year, I don't think.
I think
But
Bell Helmets have got a factory or something there, haven't they? I think. I may be wrong. Maybe
you
it's stopped now. I don't know.
you know more than me once again, Peter, as per usual.
Well, I don't know if I'm right about that, but anyway, I think they have.
Mr. Windsor, as is
Mhm.
customary, out
Yes.
of the Japanese Grand Prix race weekend, round three, what, in your humble opinion, was the biggest story?
I was dreading you asking this one, Cam, because I'm still very confused by the whole thing. I'm actually a bit depressed this morning, to be honest,
Oh,
because I WhatsApped a mate of mine because I don't think it was evident over the weekend, but it now seems pretty clear. I've spoken to a few sources in the teams, engineering sources, and they're all basically saying that in Sector 1 in Suzuka, they were using very, very little, if any, electric power as part of the power unit, which means, of course, they were using the ice in Sector 1 because they were so paranoid about not having enough electrical power for the rest of the lap and how they would generate enough power. So Sector 1, they presumably thought limited by the speed through the S's anyway. So that would be a good place to sacrifice electric power and make sure they had everything for the run out of turn 9 and out of the hairpin and on the back straight. But do you realize what that means? That means that if it's true, and I suspect it is because I'm hearing it through all sorts of sources now, the Grand Prix car of 2026, in theory, the most advanced Grand Prix car of all time, is now producing through the S's in Sector 1, was producing about 500 and 550 horsepower, which isn't much more than a Cosworth DFV used to produce. In fact, it's probably about the same. And they weigh what? I don't know, it was 550 kilos from memory, I think, back into the Cosworth era. And they're now at sort of 700 kilos, 750 maybe. And so they're actually probably slower. The cars are probably slower than what they were doing in Sector 1 up through the S's in Suzuka. Now, you could argue, this is why I'm a bit depressed and a bit confused, because you can argue, well, you couldn't really see that on TV and it looked pretty cool going through the S's. Not a lot of overtaking in the middle of the S's. That was bad, but it was all pretty cool, wasn't it? But where's the demands on the drivers? I mean, when the Grand Prix car today is that slow on a great section of road. What is it all about? I suppose that's my main thing after Suzuka. What is it all about? And I've never really had to
Well,
ask myself that question before because I've always been able to, go back to a book and look at pictures of Fangio drifting down through the S's at Rouen. I can then relate that to something that's going on today. In a perfect world, you'd relate it to Kimi Antonelli winning two in a row, as I did yesterday in the video. I sort of, it reminded me the situation of Nigel winning his first two races. But of course, driving a 900 horsepower Williams Honda FW10B or FW10, Patrick didn't actually give it a B nomenclature, even though it had a completely new back end around Brands Hatch, a bumpy Brands Hatch was, I would have to say, somewhat more demanding than what we're seeing today. And that's the problem. That and I can't reconcile in my brain yet. I guess being fairly small brained, I guess I'll get around to it in the end. But I'm finding this whole dichotomy incredibly difficult to understand. And when you think that these cars are actually slower than a Cosworth Formula One car from the
oh,
70s in terms of power to weight ratio up through the S's at Suzuka, and slower, presumably, than a Super Formula car right now, which I think is 550 to 600 horsepower, Toyota and Honda engines, then you really have to worry and wonder and be confused. I think anybody who's not confused isn't looking deep enough. And that's fine. You can look you can look at Formula One superficially, and you can count the number of overtakes. But I suppose the other thing, if I'm allowed to have two, I would suppose the other thing is that one of the major overtaking points of Suzuka, i.e., into the chicane after 130R, has now basically gone. Oh, but Peter, there were lots of passes there. Yeah, but in order to make a pass there, you basically then got blown off going down the pit straight into turn one. So it effectively nullified that great passing place and the art of coming out of 130R in a really nice position to get the run on into another guy in a corner where they used to be able to, do a little bit under braking, because it's quite easy actually to brake. Used to be quite easy to brake too early there, but now it's all governed by, power and harvesting, and all that element's gone out of it as well. I don't know. It's in a time when obviously people are clamoring for more overtaking and overtakes, we're actually neutralizing the overtaking area at Suzuka. I don't get it. I just don't get it.
Do you think they'll change it, Peter? Because they released a statement yesterday saying that they're going to use the next 4 weeks to have a think and sit down on the back of Oscar Piastri saying we need to tweak something fairly urgently on safety grounds. Charles Leclerc saying something not dissimilar. Max saying he's potentially going to leave the sport. Is it a matter of when now and not if that they do make changes to the existing rule and reg set?
Well, you're asking me how politically it all works. And I've got as good a clue as you about that. All I would say is that I now know for a fact that early on in the formulation of these regulations, it wasn't just one, it was several key team people saying, we shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. And they all got shouted down. Shouted, go ahead with a drastic rule change like this that's completely changed the face of the sport. Why do we have any confidence now that they're going to make more changes because more people are saying the same thing and starting to understand it? Yeah, I'm fairly critical, I have to be, of people shouting now after the gate is shut. All these people, Oscar Piastri, Max, all these people, why weren't they saying this 3 years ago?
Yeah, fair. I suppose Max was.
Well,
Max
Max,
was.
okay, fairness, he was, but I guess they didn't know exactly what it was going to be like. But then again, they are in a position to find that out. They are the Formula One drivers, and if they really pester their team principals enough, they would get that information. But yeah, okay, we'll leave the drivers out of it. But why are people complaining about it now when they accepted it for the rules that were written? That's the problem. And you can't really blame the rule formulators because they're just responding to what they're told to do. And it all comes down to not enough people paying enough attention at the right time and spending enough time talking to real people who understand what the sport's all about. And yeah, of course, Oscar's 100% right. Of course, Max is completely, it's completely understandable that he might want to walk away from Formula One. Of course, what we saw with Oliver Bearman and what we saw triggering that is exactly what and I think several others have been saying will happen. There will be more of these if they don't do something about it. But what can they do about it? When you've got a circuit like Suzuka, which used to be the best circuit on the calendar, and now they're only basically using just over half the amount of available power through the S's, and they're nullifying one of the overtaking places, and they've got a speed differential shunt going on. That's happening at Suzuka. There's a lot that needs to be changed. They can't start having more lights on the back of the car. This was a split-second thing for Ollie Bearman. There's no way lights would have solved that problem. And imagine this. Imagine if they hadn't come back to 8 megajoules for qualifying. It would have been
my
even
goodness,
worse.
Yeah. We dodged a bullet, Peter, for sure. It
Yeah.
felt like a tipping point. In that it feels like the regulatory body now needs to act, that they can have whatever conversations they want to, but ultimately, when we get to Miami in 4 or 5 weeks' time, there needs to be some substantive change, right? They've got to effect for it. This isn't a conversation, the outcome of which can be instituted for next year. They've got to do something now, right?
Well, yeah, okay, but what? They'll
So
make it more complicated. And already, coming back to 8 is a band-aid on a band-aid that had been applied when they started to panic on how they'd be able to regain the power anyway around Suzuka. So it's 2 band-aids. And 2 wrongs probably produce another third wrong.
yeah.
That's the result of everybody having 4 weeks to think about it and do even more damage, if that's the right word. Nothing is going to fix this other than to go back to a proper Formula One with cars that are driven on the limit and approached and the corners of which are approached on the limit, and the great drivers have an opportunity to do their great things. And if you want more overtaking, not that difficult. We had great overtaking in 2021, didn't we? Who would say, if
Yeah.
you look back now at 2021, you think of that epic season
Oof.
between
Oof.
Lewis and Max. Is anybody saying, oh, that was a terrible Formula One? I'm so glad we got away from that.
No, no, no chance. No chance. Let me pitch a
Yeah.
couple souls, a couple hypotheticals. Souls is the wrong word, Peter. Excuse me,
Mm.
but a couple hypotheticals. What about what's been rumored is that they tinker with the ramp, the extent to which they can deploy and charge at any one particular time, and then on top of that, potentially tinker with the 50-50% ice electric contribution as far as the output of the engine. Maybe make it 60-40, 65-35, leaning towards the ICE as versus the electric. Do you think any of those ones, not the solve, Peter, but if it's a difference in extents and not kinds, do any of the aforementioned make it better, closer to proper traction limited racing?
Yes, going back to more percentage of ice for sure. I mean, is anybody talking about bringing back the MGUH? That's something else. If we had
Do you want to
MGUH,
risk?
it,
Do you want to risk disenfranchising Audi though, Peter? Is
yes,
the issue?
absolutely. They don't want to be in Formula One. They can go and do something else. Welcome back Renault or welcome Toyota. There'll be another Audi if they can't face it. But no, I mean MGUH is the lack of it is part of the problem, and that was a fairly simple thing. A simple thing to keep. Let's put it that way. Complicated piece of kit, that's for sure. But Formula One have done a pretty good job, hadn't it, over the last 6 years in developing the MGUH into something that was refined and worked very well. And that was just thrown out the window. So that's another thing they could do. I mean, yeah, I mean, the more ice there is, the better from my point of view, from the point of view of, I think, of all fans, because all this business of harvesting and deployment may be fascinating to engineers, to a very microscopically small part of the Formula One community. But I think everybody else wants the racing to be relatively uncomplicated so they can understand what's going on and see the great drivers doing what they can do and breaking for the hairpin at Suzuka actually meaning something as distinct from how much energy we're going to deploy there to pass this car.
Insane.
I mean, I thought it was so sad to hear Red Bull talking to Max and saying, "Look, we're going to try something here. It's going to give you a bit more deployment going into the chicane. You're going to pass Pierre probably, but then be ready for him to repass you straight away coming out of the chicane." I mean, they might as well. What's the point of having Max Verstappen in a racing car if you're going to have a driver that, I mean, any driver could respond to that sort of stuff. You don't need to be Max to do what he did yesterday, sadly. That is the
Yeah.
point. And yes, there will be some upsides to that because there will be other young guys coming in and going instantly quick. Because if you've got all the things you need to be a racing driver, the balance, the reflexes, the timing, the eyesight, all the physical attributes, and you've done all your feeder formulae, and you've done a decent stint with an F1 team on the sim and listening to the radio, it's not going to be that difficult to go in and plug yourself in and do this job because it is a plug-in job. And as I keep saying, a guy like Max actually doesn't have many tools in his toolbox now that he can play with in order to be better than an Isaac Hadjar or an Arvid Lindblad.
Yeah.
Because it
Yeah.
is all about, but Formula One cars now are basically just dragsters, and it's just a question of, who's got the most power coming out of a corner, as far as I can see, and that's fine if you like drag racing, but I've always loved Formula One cars because of their braking and of their cornering speed and the speed they can be driven at which they can be driven into a corner, and then the rotation, the difference in rotation that all the drivers have. It's not just a geometrical apex. And there's another thing while I'm on that, talking about Apex. What is all this thing about banking now that they want to bring into Formula One? What is the point of neutralizing a corner by banking it? The whole point of Formula One was to make corners difficult and demanding. Banking actually just takes that away. You just drive in and everybody can go around the banking. It's not actually that difficult. Yes, it looks incredibly dramatic and spectacular on TV, probably. But again, for me, that's going in the wrong direction. Why do we want bank corners? I just don't get that either. I'd much rather see Max Verstappen driving through a completely flat, changing radius, left or right hander in fifth gear than I would see him going around a bank corner in sixth or seventh flat out. What's the point of that?
I think you just answered your own question, Peter. It's it is spectacle, right? Too much circus and not enough circuit. Some say
Yeah.
that
Well,
Liam
it is,
Park.
and that's why I'm confused because a lot of my I was saying I was a bit depressed because my mate, his response to my talking to him on WhatsApp about the basically sector one is only ice now in Formula One. His response was, well, that's what you get for being a purist or something like that. And I just thought,
Oh,
well, yeah, okay, but um is it actually bad to be a purist? I've no idea. I mean, do
let's have this conversation, Peter.
I
This is
mean, do the
interesting.
Netflix people who love Formula One at the moment think it's the best thing that's ever happened? Do they think that being a purist is the same as, I don't know, being whatever is it a bad, is it a negative term? I don't know. For me,
I,
it's always been it's always been a badge of honor, actually, to be honest. If I think about,
I,
I'm not talking about myself now. I'm thinking about all the people I respect in the sport, and whether it be journalists, whether it be drivers, whether it be engineers, there are many in that I would categorize as purists, even today, racing today, and I think, wow, that guy's a real purist. That's brilliant. But I suppose, are there people out there thinking, oh, he's a purist, isn't that terrible? Get him out of the pit lane now. Is that what happens today?
I think there is a pervading sentiment that purists like myself are potentially enemies of F1 progress. If we're talking about F1 under the aegis of broadening the market, growing it, keeping the attention dollars of the 18 to 35-year-old demographic, that me talking about my how much I love watching Max in 2021, threading the needle through Saudi Arabia, the first time that anybody's been around the track, and blah 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 blah. They'll look at me and say, "Well, okay, Cameron, that was 2021, but now it's 2026, and there are other boxes and other Rubik's cubes for which we need to
Hmm.
solve in F1, which is problematic, Peter. It's a fine balancing act, and I just think without leaning into the enemy of progress thesis, I just feel like I'm not. Would I love for them to bring back V8s and V10s and V12s? 100,000%. That's not going to happen though. But I think the closest thing that we're going to get to a solve. I'm not asking them to revolutionize the rule and reg set, but just bring it back a tad. 65-35 would be a great start as an example. Because I think, Peter, we'd be happy. All I want to see is that the traction limited thing again, right? I just don't want to see this annoying anticlimactic crescendo of an engine when we're going into turn 9, turn 10 at Albert Park. And that for me is the limiting factor. Whatever, if we knew hypothetically that 60-40 would make it so that across a 22 race calendar, we'd never hear any super clipping, I'd put all of my X's in that F1 ballot box, Peter. And I think you would as well. I think you'd be very happy with that, right? Much happier
Well, I'd
than
be
you are
very
now.
happy with that. But the other thing that really grates is the lack of battery coming out of the chicane when you've just passed somebody. And
No.
that again that's absolutely contra to what motor racing is all about. If you've made a pass under braking and that's your overtake, you deserve to be in front there. You don't
Yeah.
deserve then to be blown away because you've used too much power going in a sort
Yeah.
of power harnessing area. And even at 60-40, that can happen. That's the problem. And what to me, the worst thing at Suzuka, well, the worst thing was obviously the ice in sector one, ice only, and how slow effectively then that racing car is. But the other thing was this absurd passing into the chicane and then being repassed out, which made a nonsense of the word overtake.
No.
And
Not
that's
not
what we
not
need to
what
eliminate. That's the second thing we need to eliminate. And the third, of course, is what I've been saying all along, speed differential. And that has to be broken down to the start as well. And
yeah.
again, we had horrendous speed differentials off the line at the start. And no incidents, so nobody's talking about it. But there will be more for sure.
I had a friend,
When
Mr.
some cars are doing 140, other cars are doing 90.
It's crazy. It's
Yeah,
bonkers. The speed
yeah,
differential is chaotic.
yeah.
Just speak to that very quickly, Peter, because
Mm.
I've got a friend who once said that he's attended far too many funerals of friends as far as XF1 drivers, and that F1 could never be too safe. Um, do you think, therefore, that they need to the onus is on F1 making the change, not tomorrow or in a couple of months' time, that they need to make it now before you get another Ollie Bearman and Colapinto or Colapinto earlier on in the season, and somebody's walking away or not walking away from an incident seriously injured or worse.
Well, I've said many times on my channel that whilst I love all the safety that's built into a current Grand Prix car, the survival cell and the way a Romain Grosjean can actually get out of the car like that. I love that. And I will never, ever be negative about those incredible achievements that engineers have made in that area. I've always countered that by saying, but motor racing is still very dangerous, particularly in a straight line, because none of the circuits have been built to accommodate aircraft crashes on the main straights. They all assume that they're going to happen under braking into a corner and away where there's runoff area. But if something goes wrong on the straight, this is long before these 26 regulations came out, and that's why I was so tough on, so critical of Lance Stroll when he drove into Fernando Alonso in the US Grand Prix a few years ago, and into his teammate Vettel actually in Brazil not long afterwards, and he got away basically with a rap on the knuckles, and that's not good enough. That what he did was horrendously dangerous at high speed. And Charles and Barcelona last year, similar thing with Max. You know, that for me, that was the one big thing from that Grand Prix was that Charles got away with that. I just can't believe that he did. When you think of the other penalties that are handed out for drivers doing something pretty innocuous. Anyway, to get back to the point, I've always said be very, very careful about the way it's going in Formula One because we're not paying enough attention to what would happen if something went wrong on the straight, particularly, let's say, the run out of Sanderboat at Monaco as they go up the hill. Two cars touch there and get interlocked. One of them can go over the parapet there. Believe me, it can happen. And nobody's ever reacted to that. There have been no changes to the circuits at all in that area. And when these regulations came in and we saw for the first time the problems of super clipping and all that, the first thing that I thought of and said was, well, this is making that problem on the straights 10, if not 20 times worse than it was, because now there is a real potential for this to happen. And again, nothing happened. Everybody said, oh, no, it's fine. Light here, that there. And look, we've had our first shunt. And that was high speed. Ollie, very lucky to get away with what he did. And, you know, Colapinto, I suppose you can't blame him. He was probably following instructions. I don't think he was actually. I didn't hear anything on the radio telling him to go back to sixth compared with what he'd been doing the previous lap, which was seventh. Got to say, that was a bit silly, wasn't it? When you've got somebody very close behind and you suddenly change your gear change pattern in a place that you wouldn't expect it at high speed. And instead of staying in seventh, you come back to sixth again when you know there's somebody right behind you. Not clever. Anyway, he hasn't had any blame for this, so I guess we have to accept that. But Ollie had no chance at that point. And he just, I think Colapinto was very lucky he wasn't hit by Ollie. Very.
100%.
So credit to Ollie for avoiding that.
Yeah, no, he did very well.
And so that's another problem, and that's a circuit problem. You know, this can and a lot of these street circuits that have been built now, the Qatars and not the Qatars, sorry, the Saudis and the Miamis are all, you know, there's a lot of straights there with just walls either side and wire mesh fencing. And that is spooky. That's very spooky when it comes to a car suddenly doing something weird on the straight.
Yeah.
Slowing down. You've only got to slow down 5 or 6 kilometers an hour. It doesn't have to be any more than that. And all of a sudden there's going to be a shunt.
Problematic, Peter. Did you not think for a second, me watching it in real time, I thought that Ollie might have just been a bit of an eager beaver, that he's been a racing driver and that there wasn't a move to be had around the outside, and that he had not the vast proportion of the culpability pie, but you've got to talk about the rules and regs, but that Ollie has some blame to be taken, right?
Well, I mean, given the way we've seen all the overtakes on the outside, particularly turn 7 in China, who can say whether or not they were both at maximum power anyway there?
True.
If they were both harvesting, Ollie's absolutely correct to be going down there to get the inside run into Spoon. But no, the problem was Colapinto going back. He gets into 7th, and then he goes back to 6th, obviously to try and do a bit more recharging. with a guy right
Yeah.
behind him. That's the problem. He only lost about 6 or 7 kilometers an hour, but it was more than enough to change the approach speed for Ollie. He was already judging what he was going to do based on Colapinto's left rear, and that was his apex, if you like. And all of a sudden, the thing
Mm,
slows down. What are you going to do?
insane.
You just don't expect. You'd never do that. I mean, it's tantamount to brake testing.
I was just about to say.
Yeah, it's the same. I mean, obviously, it wasn't deliberate in that sense, but it's just the same effect. It's what Grosjean did to Max at Monaco when Max had that big shunt getting into Saint Devote.
Peter, and to Max Verstappen, it feels like the rumor about his future, or the rumor mill about his future, has never been more fervent around potential, not just Mercedes, because again, he's got the performance clause in his contract outside of the top two as of the summer break, and he can effectively leave Red Bull on a Bosman and go to wherever he wants, potentially Mercedes. That's been the chatter up until this weekend, the erstwhile. Now the chatter on the back of some very pointed Max Verstappen quotes that he's not enjoying it, that he's got to ask himself the same question every morning. He's got to try and get up and drive a car that he doesn't want to drive in a formula that he doesn't enjoy. Of course, he's comparisons to Mario Kart, etc., etc. There are lots of articles being written about Max Verstappen, but both British and Dutch journalists, whether Max Verstappen hangs around to 2027. Peter, I'm going to break your rule here and ask you a yes or no question. Please do expand. Do you think Max Verstappen retires in 2026?
Retires from Formula One,
Yeah.
but continues racing other stuff. Yeah, I think he will. Wouldn't surprise
Wow.
me because I don't think he ever expected it to be this bad. As much as I was a little bit critical, saying, why wasn't he and other drivers a little bit more vociferous when these rules are being drawn up? It's no good saying now that they're upset with him, but you made your point that Max was to some extent, and I've then countered that by saying maybe they didn't know to the full extent how they were going to be. But for all the reasons I've just said, Max would be thinking now, why do Red Bull need me? They can get Yuki Tsunoda back in the car and he'll probably be doing the same job as me. And we saw that in qualifying. He's out qualified by Isaac Hadjar.
Insane.
Yeah, well, it's not
Insane.
insane. Isaac is very quick, and I did say that regardless of the cars, he's probably going to out qualify Max 2 or 3 times this year, and I did say that before the season started. But beyond that, I think, why do you need a Max? When you can plug in a very, very good young guy, and he'll probably do exactly the same job. When the engineers are saying to Max, okay, on this next lap, Max, we're going to give you strategy X, and that's going to enable you to pass Pierre Gasly going into the chicane, but it's also then going to mean that you're going to get repassed by Pierre. That is computer games. It's not motor racing. You don't need Max Verstappen to exercise all that stuff. Any driver, any top racing driver can do that. And that's very different from what Max Verstappen has done throughout his career, where he's created corners that are unique to other drivers and he breaks in a different way. And he's not the only driver that does that. Charles, Lewis, many others have got their own style. Everybody has their own style, but Max has done it incredibly well. But he's unable to use any of that stuff now. He's just a normal racing driver.
Wow.
They might as well put in, and it will happen. A team will put in a driver who's pretty competent, but okay, it could be, now's the door is wide open, I think, now for the first female Formula One driver, first in a long time, to come in and be really successful. And there are plenty of them out there. They're all understudies of Formula One teams now. They're all very bright. They're all very, very articulate in terms of IT and how to operate the car. The G loads are less now. Absolutely no problem for a woman to come in now and be really successful in Formula One. So I suspect some of the Formula One teams are thinking, on the back of this and what Liberty have given us, let's really expand on that. And we'll get, this driver's going to produce a massive amount of publicity and sponsorship, and that driver's going to do this. Because if you train them well and your car's got reasonable balance and grip, which of course the Red Bull doesn't have, then they're quite capable of winning a Grand Prix. And that is no disrespect to women at all. I'm saying the door has never been wider open in Formula One than right now for a woman to come in and be very successful in Formula One. And to that backdrop, that's why Max is saying, well, I can't really contribute anything here. I'm just another racing driver. I've got a lot of other things I want to do. I think I'm going to go and do this or that.
What do you make, Peter, of Max Verstappen naysayers who would say, well, this just this makes me feel vindicated in accusing Max of being a front runner, a fair weather driver. That when he's got the Newey machine and everything's going well, and he's got the ground effect car, and it's perfect, and he's manipulating the car in and on around the limits of adhesion. That perfect. But now that it's hard times and he doesn't have the car and he doesn't like the rules, he doesn't have the adaptability of, say, a Michael Schumacher. What do you make of those F1 fans and or Max Verstappen, they says, that will feel vindicated hearing Max now talk about retiring potentially?
Not much really. I mean, basically, and you could point to a few examples, I suppose, of that. But I think again, every driver has his own style. Every driver is his own person. Every driver has his own background and his own history. And if you look at it purely from Max's point of view, he's never been driven by fame or by trophies on the wall or glamour. He's driven only by getting out of bed and driving a racing car and really enjoying it and doing a good job at it. That's the only thing that's really motivated him throughout his career. And if he's not enjoying it, why would he do it? And why would he drive at the best of his ability? Because, well, I'm sure he drives at to the peak of his ability, but the peak that he's now reaching is not a particularly high peak because a lot of the tools that he used to be able to use to take him to a much higher peak are no longer there. They're not available anymore. They've been neutralized by all the business of the power harnessing and the deployment and all that management of the car has watered down his talent in the same way you see it with Charles. That's why Lewis and Charles are much closer now.
Mm.
Yeah, there was a difference, one that came halfway through the race, and Charles' tires are in better shape, but Lewis is pretty strong now, pretty strong, and that's because things have become neutralized. I said this after China. It's very clear. Kimi with George. Kimi's doing a better job than
Oof.
George now of driving a dragster. And what George used to be able to do really well, and turn one was always one of his great corners, I think, for George Russell at Suzuka. He's always been brilliant there. But it didn't actually add up to anything. He was good in turn one, but it didn't add up to anything. Max was really good through turn seven. It didn't really add up to
Twined.
anything. That's the problem. And when you've had this success, it will eat inside you for sure because you think this is somebody else can do this. I'm not doing anything special here. And I
Yeah.
think that's basically that was the demeanor of Max when he crossed the line. It was just like, oh well, I did what I did, but it wasn't pretty good, wasn't very good because the car was just wouldn't allow me to do any more. That was basically what he was saying. And you say Michael Schumacher, but the minute the Bridgestones went off the boil, and I
That's a
think what
good
was it when
shout.
they couldn't had to run the tires the whole way through or something, wasn't it? He didn't adapt that well, and he didn't adapt that well when he went to Merck either. So I don't. I mean, if you think
Mm.
about, I'm just trying to think of parallels of this. In '66, they changed the Formula One regulations from 1.5 liter to 3 liter, and Ferrari and quite a lot of teams had Repco obviously had good 3 liter engines ready to go. But Lotus didn't. Lotus, who had been dominating Formula One, didn't have an engine. So they ran a 2 liter engine against the 3 liters. And you could argue then that Jim Clark could have said, well, what is the point? How am I going to beat these guys? And he didn't. He didn't win a race, apart from when he got a 3 liter engine right at the end. He didn't win a race with a 2 liter car, but he was always absolutely flat out and drove beautifully in the Lotus 33. And that's because the regulations didn't do anything that prevented the drivers like Clark doing something into a corner that was pretty special. And I believe that if these cars allowed drivers like Max still to do something pretty special, albeit they don't have the great package, but they could still make up for some areas where they're losing, then I think he'd be loving it and he'd be relishing the challenge. The problem is that he at the moment can't see any way that he can express himself as a racing driver, as a true racing driver that he has been all his life. All he can be is just another racing driver, like everybody else in that lineup, you know.
No.
And that's whilst if you're a young guy and you say, "Oh, I don't want to do this. This is boring." Yeah, you could say, "Oh, well, that's a bit defeatist." But if you're Max Verstappen and you've done what you've done, and everybody knows how good he is, it's completely understandable that he would say, "What is the point?" And it's not
Yeah,
as if he wants to stop driving, but it's clear he wants to keep racing. Otherwise, he wouldn't be doing the Nürburgring for Pete's sake. You know,
yeah.
you see my
I,
point?
I, I agree with you 100%, Peter. And as a Max Verstappen stan, some say, I'm desperate. I'd be gutted if Max Verstappen left the sport, Peter. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, but I
To
would be
express an
too.
opinion,
I would be too.
devastated.
But do you think when they drew up these regulations at any stage they said, but what happens if this neutralizes the drivers and the great corners, and we lose guys like Max and Charles Leclerc, and
No,
they go off and do something else? Do you think anybody actually said that and thought that? Of course they didn't, because
that's
Formula One people don't think that far ahead, and they don't think that
mm,
deeply. They just think, particularly when they're coming up with a set of regulations that is this technical, it's run by technophobes, and they don't think in terms of what does Charles Leclerc do with a car that Lewis
mm,
Hamilton doesn't these days. What does he do into cops that Lewis isn't doing? They don't think like that. They just think cops is seventh gear or this is eighth gear and what speed they're doing. They just break everything down digitally, and therefore, what Fangio does with the 250F is no different from Mendeteghi in a 250F. It's just,
fair.
the S is a fourth gear at Rouen sort of thing. And that's the problem. That's the problem because, it's a direct function of Formula One being an incredibly complicated sport that is 60% car, 40% driver, to quote
Mm,
Enzo Ferrari. And that is the overall problem. You have too many people of different backgrounds in powerful positions, all with vested interests. And now it's all
pulling and
multiplied
pushing.
by money, money, money.
Finally, on Max, Peter, I've often said
Mm,
that I know Max will say openly that he's not invested in legacy and he doesn't read F1 media. But then when Zach Brown says, "Oh, nobody can win if you don't have the quickest car," Max is very quick to have a word with Zach and say, "Well, not so fast, Zach Brown. And now you see my ability to be the difference maker." And I say that only to ask you this question, Peter. I've
mm,
often said that the way that you see Max is when not in 2022 or 23 when he's got the best car by a gazillion miles. The best time to watch a Max Verstappen is in the early running of a 2025 when he hasn't got the best car, and you're going to
mm.
see him pull one round the outside of an Oscar or nail a Suzuka lap from the gods in qualifying, and that's the sort of stuff that will cement his legacy. That as of the time of writing, is kind of outside of the POV of Max Verstappen. Do you not think that this is a similar example, Peter, of that? That what I want to see from Max is his ability to prove his greatness beyond reasonable doubt and drive these. Because if Max puts his mind to it, I don't doubt for a second that he could drive the wheels off these cars in these reg set. So to overcome and come back and right, not right the ills. I think he'll have, in his mind at least, I think he'll have a score to settle with Lando Norris. He'll feel like he should have won last year and for whatever reason didn't. Don't you think it cements Max's greatness, therefore, if he comes back from this and stays in the sport and goes on to win another 3 or 4 or 5 championships?
Well, at the risk of using an overused word, it's quite an existential question because it takes into account the way Max thinks and what drives him as a human being and as an athlete. I mean, I look at it in more simple terms, which is that I would rather see Max going through the Suzuka S's with 1,000 horsepower under his right foot than 500 horsepower under his right foot.
100%. Yeah.
And even if on the rest of the lap, the Red Bull's pretty slow, that's what I want to see. I want to see a driver as good as Max controlling 1,000 horsepower through those S's and through Beckett's at Silverstone. That's what I want to see. And because the way the regulate, we've never had this situation in Formula One before, where a set of regulations have suddenly landed on the sport, where drivers, the great drivers, are unable to express themselves in the way they normally used to be able to on the approach to corners. And so I think I'm not really answering a question, but I might be finding my way there. I think that if Max was in George's car now, I don't think he would be blowing Kimi away. I think Kimi would be looking just as good against Max as he does against George. And I think that's, just to repeat the point, I think that's because they've neutralized the tools with which he can play. And Kimi is maximizing all the tools in his toolbox. Whereas George is a little bit confused about throttle application out of slow corners, getting on the power sooner maybe than Kimi or not. It's getting your head around the reality that these cars are basically dragsters. And that's across the board now. That is across the board. I mean, Lando is probably asking too much of the car in his very soft, supple way going into slow corners than Oscar, who's probably got a feel more now for getting the car absolutely straight and getting the power down in exactly the right way out of a corner and doing it very well. And you could say, yes, that is an art, and Max needs to adapt to that art, but it's a pretty perfunctory, low-level art relative to being able to go into a corner, extending the straight, turning in on the brakes, decreasing the speed against steering load, making sure you don't have any understeer, keeping the front just where you want it to be, not worrying about low minimum speed, rotating the car at the perfect moment, and then extending the straight out. That is a much, much, much more
Oh,
difficult thing to do. That's why drag racers are not very good racing drivers. Danny Ongaias was a drag racer. He wasn't bad. He was pretty good in Formula 5000, but he didn't really adapt to Formula One very well. And so it goes. But having said that, I bet Max is a pretty good drag racer. So,
yeah.
all I'm saying is, why suddenly turn Formula One into a drag race sport? Why? What's the point? You've got drag racing out there anyway. And if Liberty want to have a world global product that is basically drag racing, they can get 1 million celebrities to come and do it and probably get even more viewers than they have for Formula One.
This is true.
So
This
why
is
play
true.
around with something that's working so well? I just don't get it. I still don't get it. And when people did say, this isn't good for corners, this isn't good for great drivers, nobody listened. Why? It just doesn't make sense.
Good
I
points
haven't
again,
really answered
Peter.
your question, but I'm trying to explain that if Max does suddenly walk away, I would understand that because it wouldn't be, I can't win, I'm not going to race anymore. It's not that at all. You think Max hasn't had a lot of satisfaction finishing ninth in a very bad car? Of course he has. If he's driven the wheels off the thing, but
Mm,
what he did at Suzuka yesterday, he got the most from the car, but he didn't drive the wheels off it. He wasn't allowed to. He couldn't drive the
yeah,
wheels off it because he didn't have the power to do it. That's the
yeah.
problem. Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm making myself relatively coherent
I,
because it's a unique problem that we've never had in Formula One before, and it's enough to make any driver go insane, I would have thought.
I suppose the question that I'm asking and failing to ask you, Peter, or trying and failing to ask you is: does Max damage his legacy in the eyes of esteemed journalists like yourself if he picks up and leaves in a season where it's difficult and he doesn't have a good car, rather than sticks it out as did a Michael through the early years? I know different examples, but a difference in extent to not kinds, right? That Michael through the Ferrari years, the dark years, and others. Does it impact Max's legacy to the downside if he full stops new paragraphs in 2026?
Well, I mean, when Jody Scheckter suddenly retired at the end of 79 and when Nico suddenly retired, everybody said, oh, well, they don't want to race anymore. That's okay. Legacy's untouched. In Max's case, I don't think he'll just retire. He'll continue to race. So there's a difference, isn't he? So what people will say, I think historians will be confused, won't they? They'll say, wow, this guy is amazing in Formula One. And he suddenly stopped Formula One. He started doing endurance and this and that. And the obvious implication is he didn't like Formula One anymore and just wanted to keep racing. And is that a bad thing if that's the message he sends out? Isn't that what he feels? He's expressing himself absolutely true to his own heart. And he's saying, I don't enjoy this anymore because I can't actually get any pleasure driving these cars. I can't impart anything
Mm,
over and above being just a normal average racing driver. And I don't want to be a normal average racing driver. I want to test myself. I want to be a better driver every day. And I want to do that on circuits like the Nürburgring now. And I'm going to find other ways of testing myself. But I can't test myself in Formula One because it's not an area now where I can do anything. I'm not learning anything. I'm not progressing. And the whole point of life is to be a better person every day, to grow as a human being every day. And if Max, as a racing driver, feels that he's not growing, I can imagine that's a terrible feeling because racing's hard enough as it is. It's A, it's dangerous. B, it's all the other stuff that comes with it. Dramas with journalists or whatever stuff he doesn't want in his life. But the one justifiable thing is that, oh, I can get in the race car, put the visor down, I can enjoy myself here, even if it's for ninth place, you know. And the number of times Max has driven a race through the, obviously from the front to the back, but even to the midfield when the Red Bull wasn't that great, he's got out of the car and said, "Wow, I really enjoyed that." You know, that was just flat out the whole way. I know we got 2 points, but it's great. I loved it. But now, you know, you're
Um,
basically just you're basically sitting in a package that is being controlled by a lot more than ever before by the pit wall, and
al
that's
algorithm.
you know, and we had a thing where you weren't, you know, there was a big thing at one point about driver aids, and we got to make sure there are no driver aids in Formula One, and you can't make adjustments from the pit wall and all that sort of stuff. These don't come under the heading. Well, they are driver aids in a way because they're giving you the power when you need it most around the lap. It's all to do with power efficiency, and and now we've gone back to that. Having said for many years we don't want driver aids. Well, we got driver aids.
Yeah, I just think just to put a footnote on this, Peter.
Mm.
I think I'm speaking selfishly as a fan of Max Verstappen. That I feel like if he hangs around in F1, let's say we're blessed to get another 2 or 3 years of Max Verstappen. I enjoy dining at the restaurant of sporting endeavor par excellence, and I feel like there will be more of that, much more of that from Max to come. I think I want to see him kind of finish his F1 novel rather than leave a couple pages unwritten. You know,
I do too, but I want to see him doing it, driving a race car the way Max drives
100.
it. I don't want to have to.
Yeah.
I don't have to be thinking about why is he quick, why is he slow, because he that looked great, but he's unbelievably slow on the lap. I don't want that. I want Formula One to be logical, and I'm not sure. To me, it's not logical at the moment. You see, driving, you know, you actually do something quick, and it makes you slower.
Yeah, it's
That's the
counterintuitive a
problem
bit.
with it, you know. And again, from 30,000 feet, does that matter? No. The overall anything that matters is the overall result. And we got this great curly-haired young Italian kid who's set the world on fire and everybody loves him. And isn't that wonderful? Yeah, it is. It's great. But I defy anybody right now to tell me what he's doing differently from George Russell, actually physically
Oof.
doing differently in the car.
Oh, let's speak to it then, Peter. Since you bring it up, it's a conversation that I've been having with friends. I think George Russell after Max potentially is the next one, given some of the brilliant laps that he's put in. Singapore springs to mind, where you see him tinkering with the brake bias 5 or 6 times over the course of a 90-second hot lap. I think George Russell is very underrated as an F1 peddler. And so coming into this season, knowing that he's going to have the machinery, I'd hoped, Peter, that he was gonna deliver upon that not insubstantial potential. They were going to see him walk away with the championship. Thus far, however, Peter, it's not looking like that. Kimi Antonelli, like you said, is a lot closer, potentially because of the rules, potentially because of some fortuitous circumstance. I understand he didn't have the setup that he wanted this race weekend, and the car was much more on the nose. Do you think, Peter? Let me ask you the question this way: is George Russell still the favourite for the championship this year?
No, I don't think he is.
Oh,
And
expound,
I
sir,
say
please.
that because I don't think he understands why he's getting beaten by Kimi, and that's always a problem because then he'd have the real things to work on. And I think it's very easy for the team and obviously for George in this hiatus now to look back at China and say, yeah, electrical problem Q3, qualified on the pole, would have been a different race. And then to go to Suzuka and say, yeah, car was half reasonable at the end of FP3, but we shouldn't have made those changes. But why did he make those changes? That's the point. And you say the car was too much on the nose. I mean, what would Max Verstappen have given to drive a car on the nose at Suzuka? Anyway, why did he feel it was on the nose? That was the point. Because obviously Kimi's in the same car and he's not feeling that and he's not making those changes. That's the real point. So what's Kimi doing and asking of the car that's different from George? The only thing I could see, as I mentioned in my video, was the way they're using the power. And that was a snapshot coming out of turn 9, the slow part of Degner. And Kimi was more progressive on the throttle and reaching a higher top speed sooner than George. But George is getting on the power sooner. So, and a little bit more aggressively. That's just one corner. Maybe that was also happening in others as well. But George, I don't think at this stage is going to say, I need to start rethinking the way I apply the power out of slow corners. He's not going to do that because he's George Russell and he's won a lot of races and he's, the potential world champion. And that's the problem. That's why I say Kimi just needs to just keep on doing what he's doing. And George needs to think about the reality that these cars, yes, the Mercedes is still the best all-round Grand Prix car, but it's nonetheless a dragster like all the others. And you're going to have to drive it like a dragster. And he's going to have to come down to this realization that being George Russell actually isn't going to help him. He's got to be Kimi Antonelli now. And he's got to out Kimi somehow. That's not easy.
Oof.
That's why I say
Oof.
it's weighted pretty much now in Kimi's way, because how's George going to blow Kimi away on slow circuits? He's not.
This is
On slow
problematic,
corners,
Peter.
more to the point. Right?
Yeah.
You added up the number of slow corners ahead of us between now and Abu Dhabi, and the number of medium high speed corners ahead of us between now and Abu Dhabi. Slow corners be here, medium high speed will be there.
And where do they say you gain all your time as a
Well, yeah,
percentage of the
and
whole,
that's
Peter?
why I say this is
Yeah.
a formula for new, young, fresh drivers that don't have to worry very much about how good they are through six-gear corners in a crosswind with a flicky rear end. It's not
Yeah.
it's not significant anymore because you can just go into power mode there and power harvesting mode and cancel that bit out. Didn't like that corner there. I'll just go into harvesting mode now, and it doesn't hurt them at all.
It's not
That's the
currency
problem.
as it was
And George
previously.
May, George May at turn 9 in Barcelona be unbelievably quick compared with Kimi. He may be 5 kilometers an hour quicker coming out of turn 9 in a crosswind in Barcelona, but I bet you it doesn't add up to anything on the lap anymore
Yeah, which
because
is
they'll
a
all be
problem.
harvesting down that back straight. He won't
Let me
get
ask you
any
this
advantage
question.
at all out of being quicker,
True.
but he'll get a huge knock on the head if he's slow out of the chicanes. And Kimi's very good. I said from day one, he's very good at slow corners and slow speed change of direction.
Yeah, yeah. Peter, I've heard it often said that George Russell found himself a victim of circumstance that has done over the past couple of races, but not least Japan, given the setup stuff and the timing of the safety car. But on the other side of the fence, I've heard a good few F1 aficionados say that even but for the safety car, imagine a race where there were no safety car, that Kimi Antonelli would have still had the beating of George Russell. And it'd be fool's gold to just say, as George did in his post-race presser or debrief with Toto, that the time of the safety car happens a lap later, then I would have been on the top step of the podium. Do you think that Kimi Antonelli would have had the beating of George, even the timing of the safety car notwithstanding?
I don't think George would have beaten Oscar. I think that's the point. If there's no
Oh,
safety car, I think Oscar would have won.
oh,
And here I've got to
oh.
say, I can't imagine in a million years why McLaren brought Oscar in when they did. And I know this is speaking after the event. Everyone will say, "Oh well, how they
Yeah.
didn't know about the safety car." Putting a safety car out of it, he's actually pulling away from George, who's overheating his rear tires. He's in free air. The car's balanced. It's going well. Why did they bring him in straight away? Why did they bring him in at that point? I just didn't get that. Why didn't they run him 3, 4, 5 laps longer? Yeah, of course, he would then have had the benefit of the safety car, but I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, why did they bring him in so early? And it had George. And that's why I say I think he would have won that race. And I think if there's no safety car, Oscar would have won it. And I think Kimi would have raced hard with, I don't know, George got beaten by Leclerc, didn't he? What can you say? So, how does George put that with winning the race? I don't get it.
Problematic, Peter. And again, is that in line? Was that a
Problematic.
surprise that
Good word,
George?
yeah. What's that?
Was that a surprise? Problematic is very
Well,
apropos,
yeah.
right? Is that was it a
He got beaten
surprise,
by two
Peter?
guys that also got hurt by the safety car.
Was that a surprise to you that George couldn't get round, make and stick an overtaking manoeuvre on an ostensibly slower Charles Leclerc in Ferrari?
I don't know, because I read George's comments afterwards and he said, "Oh, we had an unexpected super clip." What the hell that means? I've got no idea. Obviously, it means the engine just presumably lost power at some point on the straight. And well, when was it? It was whenever Leclerc breezed past him. And then what did they do? They reached the limit of harvesting or something.
Yeah.
If anybody understands that, then they're a better man than I. when a racing driver's going through his Tim Schenken book of excuses. I mean, they were not in there when Tim wrote them all. And, I mean, Francois Sever and Jody Scheckter were pretty near the mark when they said that they had hay fever and they were sneezing and a tear got in the eye, and that's why they went off. But, this one, I mean, he got beaten to. I mean, Kimi may not have. I don't think Kimi would have won it. He would have been involved in all that stuff and used his tires up a bit more, probably. I think Oscar would have won that race.
Would
But that's my
Kimi?
point.
I
Yeah.
agree with you, but would
Yeah.
Kimi have beaten George? Do you think?
Um, well, he would have. I mean, George. We know what George's race was. He got beaten by Leclerc, and he had it took a long time to get past Lewis. So, where would Kimi have been in all of that? I guess he would have been a spectator behind, watching it all, looking after his tires, and he probably would have got Leclerc. So I think he would have beaten George. Yeah.
This
I
is
mean, would
damning,
George have let
Peter.
him pass? So would he have passed George? I don't know. That's a good
I think
question. I doubt it. I doubt. I mean, when George got on the radio to say, "Is Kimi going to do the restart as we practiced?" I mean, the key thing there was whether or not Kimi did. The key thing was the response, which was, "We don't know." And that was a really interesting response. I thought, it was a logical place into the chicane, but I mean, we don't know. It's not what George wanted to hear, was it?
is
And I
George.
didn't hear any of George's stuff about, I'm so proud of Kimi and so happy for Kimi. It's a brilliant thing how he's come into the team like this and what a great teammate he is. Or was it radio interference? We couldn't hear that yesterday on the slowdown lap. I didn't hear any going on in the static. So there was nothing from George. He's normally pretty talkative after the checkered flag, isn't he?
When a mentee becomes a rival, Peter,
Silence. I mean, you
probably
got to
not.
say there, George definitely matured as a human being, and he realized that whatever he said would be bad, so he better not say anything at all. And that was
Yeah,
probably the right decision. But speaking of George, I've got to ask you this, Cameron. You've never said to me, Peter, one of the reasons we have that pre-race ceremony with all the drivers lining up for the national anthem is because of you and the way you battered for that for years and years and years in the Bernie era, saying how disgusting it was that Formula One didn't acknowledge the local national anthem and have everybody at the front of the grid, the drivers out of the cars. And it's all happening because of you, Peter, and everything you did. I'm being cynical now, but obviously nobody's ever said to me at the FIA or anywhere else, thank you for your idea, Peter. But nonetheless, I'm now going to put a little addendum to that, which is that when the drivers are lining up, listening to the national anthem, they should, within reason, stand relatively motionless and not chat and giggle. It is the national anthem of that country. I know they had to do it 24 times or 22 times now, but it is nonetheless the national anthem. If you're going to go to the trouble to stand up and line up, at least show some respect for that local anthem. And yeah, I wasn't that impressed with all that giggling from George during the anthem, to be honest, in Japan. It's a lovely anthem, the Japanese one. It's quite a solemn anthem, isn't it? And, I think you can show a bit more respect than that. I'm a massive George fan. He's always been great to me and he's a lovely guy. But I think there needs to be some rules about that now, that the drivers shouldn't be all giggling and, swapping bubble gum when they're lining up
touche.
during the
Yeah,
during the
100%.
anthem. If they're going to do that, at least do it properly.
Respect to manners are free, Peter. I agree with you. You've said that very well there. Just finally on
Mm.
George, um, I don't want to speak about it. George doesn't have very many fans, Peter. People don't like him as a person. He comes
Why
across as
not?
very
He's a lovely guy.
because he comes across as very whiny. Some will say over the radio. Every time you hear him, he's like, "Oh," he sounds like he's asking for a favor. A la, well, is Kimi going to do what we put? Well, of course, he's a racer. What do you want to? What does he just cede the place to you, a la Felipe Massa and Fernando Alonso? Are we like he's gonna try and
Yeah, but that's because he
he's
sees
gonna
himself as the elder statesman, doesn't he? And he doesn't want this young kid coming in and dominating things. That's fairly understandable. I think the problem
as
is people make too many calls and judgments on drivers based on how they are in those stupid scrum
mm,
interviews, which are meaningless load of nonsense. And the radio, most of which is we're only hearing a third of it anyway. And so if you want to judge a driver, judge the driver by what he does on the racetrack. That is the point. And forget about all that stuff. Turn the volume down. It's irrelevant. And George is a very, very good racing driver. And when you talk to him about racing things, he's a brilliant guy. Yeah, I have to confess, I've never spoken to him about anything other than racing things. So, and I don't really want to, intrude on his real life. Why would I? So I think George is a good guy. But as I said, obviously now the days of young Kimi and how proud we are of young Kimi, and well over, and it's bring back Lewis, isn't
Yeah. Wow.
it? You took a while to laugh there, Cameron.
I don't know. Chaos, Peter. Okay, cool. Final question, Peter. You're super generous of your time,
Mm.
as per usual. I was going to pitch you on Scuderia Ferrari and Lewis and all that gubbins and Charles
Mm.
Leclerc, but I want to ask you a more pertinent question. It has
Mm.
been hypothesized in a race yesterday where we don't get a safety car that you would have seen for the first time in 2026 some proper racing, not overtaking driven, not yo-yo racing, but you had yourself a couple of plot lines, narrative plots at which we could have been invested as old school F1 fans, being Oscar fending off a charging George in a quicker car. That you would have got that for as near as makes no difference the race entire. And similar thing with Charles and Kimi Antonelli. Peter, do you think, but for a safety car, that we'd be here having a completely different conversation about the race? Instead of 6 out of 10, we'd all be saying 9 out of 10. These new rules and regs were perfect and fantastic, and crack on for the next 19 races or whatever.
Um, don't know. I mean, we did have a safety car, and usually there are safety cars, and so the rule makers need to bear that in mind as well. And we'll have more safety cars as we go on. So I think we've been lucky not to have had more, to be honest. So
Hmm.
I can't answer that question really. I mean, there was a safety car, there was likely to be a safety car, and it did change the face of the race the way it did. But Mercedes had the best car and they won the Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri finished second. I think he should have won that Grand Prix. McLaren are back, kind of right at the front, driven by Oscar. Actually, speaking of Lando and the whinging, and that you just described with George Russell, what do the George Russell whinging critics think about Lando whinging about Lewis having to give a place back when he runs straight on the chicane like that? I thought that if anything comes under the heading of whinging, it's that,
Um,
not the
there's a
George.
there's a fine line, isn't there, Peter, between whinging and brinksmanship? Isn't it? Isn't Lando incentivized there since
Probably, yeah.
he's yeah he's I would have done the same, Peter. I would have asked the question, as I think most of the drivers on the grid. George 1000% would have done the same. He's very quick to pull
It's a silly
that
rule, though, isn't it?
brinksmanship
It's a
trigger.
silly rule, and yeah, I don't know. All I'm saying is, yeah, of course, Lando did it from the point of view of get the stewards to look at this, but equally, a lot of what George does is based on that as well.
Oh yeah, 100%. He's acting in his own best interest.
Yeah,
And
of
what else
course,
would you expect from an F1 driver? To
of
be
course he is.
fair,
Yeah, of
yeah,
course he
wants to
is.
win every second of every race, every
I
single
mean,
season.
another storyline is how Oscar blew Lando away, actually, isn't it?
But wouldn't you
Again,
expect that, Peter, on a track like Japan?
did you?
I,
Well,
I Oscar
you know,
loves Japan and Spa.
yeah, but I mean, there were a lot of people back end of last year after Lando won the championship. Oh, Lando's Oscar failed. And again, I think you and I both agreed that this potentially was going to be a year where Oscar did hand it to Lando because Lando's going to be sort of enjoying his championship year and not quite as focused. He's going to have great weekends when he's going to be super quick and win races, and he's much quicker than Oscar. Equally, Oscar's going to have a very good year. And obviously, it's been quite a difficult start for Oscar, but now we saw that. And we saw Oscar doing things in what is now obviously a very good car. And I think that was the other thing I was going to say was I think I was a relatively lone voice before the season started saying don't rule out McLaren at a time when everybody was saying how good the Mercs were going to be. Was I not saying that?
Bravo, good
I,
shout,
I, I
very
said,
good shout.
it's hard to believe McLaren won't have a good car with that power unit. And here we are, race three, and they've got a car that could have beaten the Mercs yesterday in right circumstances, had McLaren not brought Oscar in so soon. By which I don't mean the safety car I just think he had a few more laps in that car, which they didn't trust. And maybe that's a function of the team having had a pretty rough start to the year and having got to where they are. They didn't want to take any risks at all and just played everything quite conservatively. Maybe it's a function of that. But Oscar seemed pretty relaxed in the car and seemed pretty happy to want to extend the stint a bit. And
Oh yeah,
and I was
and
a bit,
some, Peter.
I was very surprised they brought him in when they did. The
He
strategy
said in
department strikes again.
yeah, papaya rules
Well, I don't
okay.
know about that. I think it's more just the strategy department saying, no, no, he must come in now. He must come
Yeah,
in. No alternative. Got to
he,
cover George. You know.
Oscar said after the fact that he thinks that might have been his best race weekend in his career. That he
Yeah, I
was
think it
on.
was. I think
He
it
was
was. You know, he
brilliant.
was
He was
fluid, he was
fantastic.
quick, he was everything. Well, relative to Lando, of course, that was the point, wasn't it? You know, if he'd driven exactly the same way, but been 2 tenths behind Lando the whole weekend, he wouldn't be saying that. But
No,
obviously, that is a factor and how you race against your teammate, and that's a very important point.
is this the Aesop's fable finally, as far as the Piastri Lando dynamic is concerned, Peter? That when we get to high speed stuff, mention no names, Suzuka, Silverstone, Spa, you're going to see Oscar 9 times out of 10 trump Lando. But the lower speed stuff, when we get to a Monaco
Well,
as an example, you can expect Lando to come out on
it'll
top.
be fascinating because my what I can see, what looks to me is if Oscar's really becoming Oscar again, and he's starting to turn in earlier, and he's starting to be more subtle than he was. He's not probably looking at Lando's telemetry as much as he used to. He's getting on being Oscar Piastri, and that Oscar Piastri was always good on
Ooh,
slow circuits, very good.
ooh.
And I think he's now in a mode where he can be quite self-critical and think about how he's going to beat Lando around Monaco and other circuits like that. And so it'd be fascinating to see if he can do that. I think he can, and I think he will. And I think he'll be good on all sorts of circuits now. I really do. Um, but you know, I think just getting back to another point, I don't think there's one other. I mean, talking about how much Oscar enjoyed the weekend, somebody might who's listening to this or watching this might say, well, in that case, the cars are fun to drive. And why isn't Max at least getting the best out of the car that he can enjoy the handling or whatever? The reality is that a good car still is driven in a fairly controlled way, given the power deployment issues of this new formula. But a bad car no longer has the tools that enable a driver to make it an average car. That's the difference. And that's why driving a bad car in these regulations is much more insufferable than driving a pretty good car in these regulations. And that you could say that's always been the same. You know, it's always been more fun to drive a good car, but it's never been the case that in a bad car you no longer have any tools to do anything about it. That is the difference, and you can't compare the way Oscar feels when he gets out of a McLaren with the way Max feels when he gets out of a Red Bull. The feeling of satisfaction I'm talking about now.
Apples and oranges.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is in a way that we've never had in Formula One before. Never. Because if you've been down on power, you can always make up by being maybe less fuel, lighter car, more agile, do it on this corner, that corner. Or conversely, you've got a lot of power, you know, you use it well, look after the tires well, and you can take advantage here or there. But that's not the case. All those things have gone out the window. And again, you can't say, well, they've all been replaced by new things. Well, they have been replaced by new things, but those new things are not driver things. They're all technology things controlled by the pit wall.
Algorithmic F1.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh dear,
Mm.
Peter. Lots of stuff to look forward to. Wait, racing aside, I would honestly, Peter, I wished if I had a time machine and one wish, I wish that we could have avoided for that safety car because I think me and you'd be having a very different conversation about the quality of the racing. I think you would have got what you needed, what you crave and appreciate from F1 and traction limited stuff at the very least between Oscar defending and onrushing George. I'm convinced we'd be having a very different conversation, but hopefully we get that at some point later on in the year, potentially. Potentially.
But George never really got near Oscar on hard times.
But again, I mean the interaction, right? The defense, the kind of do you know what I mean? I just
Yeah,
think it
but
would
we
have been
got
a
a
lot more
picture of what that
interesting.
would have been like with the Leclerc George battle and the Hamilton George
Yeah,
battle.
yeah,
It
yeah, true.
was all after you, Claude, and then okay, I'm going to pass you, Claude, wasn't it?
But I think Oscar would have been so
Well, I mean,
pleasant and
yeah, but
polite,
Oscar,
let's
I
say.
think Oscar was always, you know, he was always pretty solid there, wasn't he? And he was always going to pull away. He was in good shape, and I think he would have won that. I do.
Oof. Oof.
I think McLaren pretend well. And I don't think they. I mean, the way it panned out, obviously he didn't, but and he couldn't with the safety car thing. But had there been no safety car, or put another way, if Oscar had stayed out 4 more laps, he might have won that.
We'll never know. Such is the
No,
beauty.
but you know he'll be thinking that for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, he kind of said that in the press conference, didn't he? He
Yeah,
said, "I couldn't say for sure, but we're in good shape. But
yeah,
nevertheless, we
of
did
course they
everything
were.
perfect
They
over
were
the
in good
course of
shape.
the."
They
Yeah,
were in good
yeah.
shape. But why was Kimi so slow off the line? Why did he have so many more revs compared with George? And on the clean side of the grid, he had 10.2, George 9.8, and more. He was quick initially, and then the whole thing just bogged down.
He, he said
And,
he wasn't deep enough with the clutch.
how would you know,
That's
Cameron? That's the point. I'm not
that's
being facetious now, but I
he-
mean, nobody knows. This is another stupid thing. All
it,
these speed differentials off the line.
I want to take Kimi at face value because he did say that in the post-race presser. However, he
What did he
said
say?
that he was I want to say I can't remember if it was too deep or not deep enough of his clutch, but he said it was a clutch issue. But he said that, Peter, critically. His demeanor and countenance said more than
Well,
his
why did he
body
have more
language.
revs? That's the point. The clutch, obviously, he has to slip it more, I would guess, or
Yeah,
less. I don't know.
he said it was a clutch, but there is a theory going around that Mercedes are doing something a bit clever with their PU in terms of in the race that leads to some sort of deficits. It's very tricky, let's say, to launch it off the line. Kimi looked like he was hiding something when he gave that clutch answer.
And why were the
He's,
Red Bulls so slow off the line?
oh, that I can't answer, Peter. That one's I don't
And
know.
why was Lindblad so quick off the line with the same power unit?
Oh wow. Okay, so that's another 60 minutes worth of conversation, Pete. Why
Well,
don't we take let's take Pete, let's take Max and just place him in a racing Bulls car and see how he does there.
yeah, there is that as well, isn't there? Not the first time we've said that either. I mean, what
Yeah.
are Red Bull doing at the moment?
Everybody's leaving. They're not backing Max. They're just all over
I
the
mean, I
shop.
mean,
Really
is
bad.
everybody? Somebody else left? Who else is leaving?
Uh Ollie Shack, engineer,
Hmm.
said that he doesn't like apparently that he doesn't like the new regime and that they're becoming far too like F1, some say that they're becoming far too corporate under
Ugh.
stewardship of one Lauren Mekis, apparently.
Yeah,
No.
I can see that because, you know, if you come from his sort of background, you're not a racer really. You're sort of very systematic in the way you do everything, and everything has to be organized like a proper company. Formula One teams are not proper companies. We all know that. And
Yeah.
and the minute you try to do that, it does take the heart and soul out of a race team. So it's a bit
Pro-
worrying, isn't it? It's a bit worrying.
problematic.
Yeah.
So
But here's the thing, if mid-season Max decides to leave, he certainly decides to leave Red Bull at the end of the year, and he does have that firm offer from Mercedes. Presumably, then it's to join alongside Kimi, right? That's what we're assuming now.
this is the rumor. A,
So,
they're very good friends, and B, I think
well,
Max
yeah,
would
but
like.
that won't last. Well, when they become racing drivers, I mean, that's not a factor at all. But the point is, how would that be managed then? As another reason, Kimi could win the world championship. If that destabilizes George to that extent.
I don't see much like again extents and not kinds, Peter, but much like Abu Dhabi 21 and Lewis. I don't see how George. I think he's a very strong-minded driver. Mental fortitude is never going to be his weakness, but I don't understand how he couldn't be destabilized by the way that Toto was quite openly flirting with getting Max Verstappen on a gazillion different occasions. He didn't say it once; he said it a number of times last year
Yeah,
that
but
he
that was
wouldn't be
just to
doing his
arrange
job.
the deal to drive the Merc at Nürburgring. We know that now.
Also, no, you joke, Peter, but he's so that's a trick. He was quite instrumental, was Toto, in rearranging the NLS schedule
Yeah,
so that
yeah,
Max could.
yeah.
How can that not destabilize George, Peter? I'd be absolutely livid with rage, and then you don't even want to give me another contract because you want to see what happens with Max and
Yeah,
whether
but
he's got a performance clause
Jim Clark
situation
wasn't livid
somewhere.
with Colin Chapman started talking to Graham Hill to replace Peter Arundel, was he? Jimmy didn't
But
say
not, but
why do we need Graham in there who's won world championships, who's obviously going to want his side of the garage, who's going to want his people. We're a very well balanced team now. I can do the job for you, Colin. Jimmy didn't do any of that. In fact,
but
he
not
didn't
to
say anything at all. And Ford had to go to him and say, "Look, we're paying Graham a bit more money than you, Jimmy. We feel embarrassed. Would you mind taking a wage rise, please?"
which is different era.
Okay.
But then
No, not a
not
different
to,
era.
not
Different people. Nothing to do with the era. It's people. Jimmy liked money as much as
also,
anybody.
but
I
different
don't think it's fair to say
circumstances.
different era.
but different circumstance, mainly substantively,
It's the
because
same thing. It's a team principal talking to a driver that the other driver doesn't think they should be talking to. There's no difference. It's exactly the same thing.
But about replacing George or replacing Kimi. Toto's talking about potentially replacing George, and that's the
I
issue.
know,
Nobody
I
was.
know. But it's the same
We're
thing. It's
never
the
going to replace Jim, right?
same effect, isn't it, in terms of your
Right.
confidence and everything else?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, George is pretty good at living in his own bubble and being his own confident self. But there are going to be quite a few factors now that he's going to have to fight. And one of them, obviously, is the Kimi factor and the rise and rise of Kimi. And the other is the Max factor. Excuse me. You know, and that's a big issue. And what would George then presumably go to Red Bull, would he? I guess.
I have no idea. I'm sure he won't be shy of suitors. Mention no names. Aston Martin, potentially Red Bull, potentially McLaren, maybe.
What do we think about the Aston Martins actually being slower than they were in China? Actually, behind the Cadillacs. I mean, what is? I mean, I said what is going on at Red Bull. What is going on there? I mean, what is going on in the world when the Adrian Newey car is at the back of the grid and Max Verstappen's beaten by a teammate?
Yeah, end of that. Has to be a harbinger
and George
of
Russell
the apocalypse.
Beat by his teammate too, around Suzuki.
Harbinger of the apocalypse. Who'd have thunk it, Peter? Not me. No, never died.
So what's all the gossip about Aston Martin now? Where are they going? How did Honda feel the weekend?
I will lean on your infinite wisdom, Peter. Last time we spoke, that these things that it feels like that the Aston Martin fast train has left the station, and that this ship will take several years to turn around. Now it will outlast Fernando Alonso's career, and Honda. I mean, they've lost the people, right? You always tell me that you win races by dint of your ability to get and keep good people. But the genius Honda engineers have left never to return. So, like, what? It's going to take a few years, right?
What about Formula One's axiom over the last 20 years that money buys everything, and there's nothing more important than money in business? And Formula One's not a sport; it's a business, it's a show. It's all about money. And Lawrence Stroll is the absolute epitome of that.
I think
more money than anybody else, and you can buy the best of everything.
It's the irony is not lost on me, Peter, that Adrian Newey, of all people, has
he shouldn't have gone there, should he? It's his own fault. He should be at Ferrari.
I mean,
or Red Bull still, one or the other. He's quite. What was wrong with Red Bull? Stayed there.
Oh, Peter, you're a legend as per usual.
But if you wanted to leave, go to Ferrari. Why go to Aston Martin with the whole thing there, that mess? What is the point?
Ferrari might come of its own problems, though, Adrian, you would argue.
Yeah, of course. No team
traveling to Italy.
No team is perfect, but at least Ferrari, the problems going in. Well, you should know the problems going into Aston Martin, to be honest. It's not difficult to read that lot as well. But I suppose it was all money again,
Yeah.
Money, and not having to fly to Italy very often. So I suppose that was the other thing in Adrian's mind, but I don't know. It's all bizarre, isn't it? Totally bizarre.
It is.
The other thing is this weird 4 weeks, 5 weeks, I don't know how long it is now, of no racing, and how the teams are going to survive.
I think they'll be all right, Peter. I think it hits Mercedes more than the rest. I think the competing teams, second down.
No, I meant financially, because they all spend their money like crazy. And they're not
fair.
And are all the TV networks taking a hit now because there are fewer races?
I don't think the TV actually is. I don't think the TV networks. Maybe that's in time.
I don't think they get a refund, do they?
No, I don't know what's happening with that.
You pay for a 24 race championship, you only get 22.
And maybe
they've got to spend 5 weeks of paying all these checks out to everybody.
Well, maybe a catch-up accrual. Yeah, maybe a catch-up accrual in terms of revenue, because again, those races aren't going anywhere. They'll do them next year or something. Maybe just I don't know. I don't know how
2 races at each circuit next year.
Yeah, potentially, maybe. Anyway, Mr. Windsor, on that bombshell, you've been a
legend
as per usual. I've got to get back to this agricultural view that I've got outside my hotel, but I shouldn't complain. Mr. Windsor, legend as always.
Brilliant,
super insightful. Guys and girls watching, if you are not subscribed to the Peter D. Windsor YouTube channel, then how very dare you call yourself an F1 fan? Go and do that now. Shortly thereafterwards, get yourself on your favorite podcasting platform. Short Corners is the pick to click. If you're watching this on the YouTubes, like, comment, subscribe, and hype. between now and next time, may all your sectors be purple.